Well, welcome everybody for another Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center, Michigan State University. And this is our Eye on Africa, our weekly seminary series. I'm very delighted today, so for our first Eye on Africa of the semester, to welcome Dr. Patricia Agupusi, who's going to talk today about the politics of land reform in South Africa and challenges ahead. So if you're familiar with Eye on Africa, you know that it's a presentation for 45 to 60 minutes, and afterwards we're going to have question and answers. So feel free to type your questions and answer your questions on the Q&A box, and after the talk, Dr. Agupusi will address them. So welcome everybody. And before we start, a brief introduction of our speaker. So Dr. Agupusi is a term assistant professor at the School of International Service, American University, DC. Prior to joining SIS-AU, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for Public and International Affairs and visiting faculty at the African Studies Department at Brown University. Dr. Agupusi is a political economy scholar with background in philosophy, international law, and economics. Her scholarship focuses on the arrangements between private institutions and governments promote or hinder development. So how the arrangement between private institutions and governments promote or hinder development. Her research includes states' capacity, domestic insurgencies, entrepreneurship and development, and Africa-China relations. She is currently working on her second book, tentatively titled State Capture and the Politics of the Two Economies, Debate 25 years after in South Africa. She is also conducting field work on the rise of domestic terrorism. Dr. Agupusi has conducted research on Nigeria, South Africa, Canada, and Kenya. Her work has appeared in peer-reviewed journals. Her first published book, of which she is the principal author, is titled Homegrown Development in Africa, Illusion or Reality. And that work appeared in 2015. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Dr. Agupusi, and you have the floor now.
It happens. That's why we're online. All right. I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Like I said earlier on, I do like to talk about my research, but pandemic has restricted us in doing so. So it is my privilege to share one of my research now, which is land reform in South Africa. Without much ado, I want to say, welcome everyone, those people I can see and, and those people I cannot see. And I hope I'll be able to provoke some questions and after the talk, and also kind of a way of addressing this type of issues. So let's get to it. So as the thanks so much have already pointed out, I work a lot on South Africa. I've done some research in South Africa. But today, what we're looking at is land reform. If you look at this slide, what you see is pictures of what is going on. Land reform in South Africa has been attracting news at least since 2008 globally. But you will think this is the only time we've heard about it. But by the time American presidents get involved, it became more of, dominant global news. So this is how you see what you get in terms of land reform In 2018, we have Tucker Carlson of Fox News making the, raising the fire over land reform, and that land is being seized from white South African. And of course, this prompted Trump to declare that this must be investigated. This went on for a very long time. Some of the people in South Africa, including the president then, responded and saying that they're not taking land, that Trump, Carlson all got it wrong. And of course, Malema, anybody that works in South Africa must have heard about Malema, and he did play a prominent role in land reform in South Africa now. The problem with this type of rhetoric is that it leads to so many things on two extremes, whereby globally, even in the US, some people have started, using it as a way, especially white in the US, the extreme white, saying, not all white, please bear with me. This is one of the ways of global way that they are, trying to subdue white people. Like you see something like this: stop killing our farmers and stop taking our land. On the other hand, youth in South Africa are also being provoked in terms of the way they go about land reform and land distribution in South Africa, as you could see with this picture. So pictures say a lot. So despite the response by the president of South Africa, it did not stop. So what do we get? Global discourse on land reform from different aspects of the, different perspectives. But it did not end there. The question we'll ask is this why we are looking at land? Or is there any other reason? Why land? So first and foremost, I'm working on a book project now. And so this research is situated within that book project that looks at transformation process in South Africa since the end of apartheid and the start of a new era in South Africa in 1990s. The title of the paper is State Capture and the Politics of Two Economies Debates. So when we talk about two economies debates, South Africa is divided in the sense that there's a few that control. Concentration of wealth is in the hand of very few, less than 10% of the population. In fact, the concentration in terms of power, 80% of wealth in South Africa is in the hand of just a handful of people. Over time, that has been reduced. That has been, the number of people has been expanding, but not as much as people would have expected. So 25 years, 30 years at the end of apartheid, we're still discussing the deep inequality that exists. We also have to, we will not forget or neglect to mention this inequality is divided by racial line. And land has a lot to do with it, not just in South Africa, but also globally. We do understand that land is a big part of wealth creation and also contributes a lot to inequality. Economies, a scholar, Frank Kemmer, did write a very detailed analysis of the role of land in global inequality, either within a country or between countries. But he's not the only one. Other economics like Piketty has also drawn from this analysis easily to try to explain how wealth over time, wealth inequality has existed and the role of land and how land distribution has a lot of impact on the structural or systematic inequality that exists in a place like South Africa. Asamoah and Robinson also did mention in their work, Colonial Explanation of Inequality and Development, to argue that the way the institution of land, partly, not all, the way the institution of land was structured has a lot of impacts, not just the institution, but the distribution of goods and services has a lot of impact. So land distribution is a big part of how a country will develop or not. In addition to this, we also understand generally that land is core factor of economic capital. You know, the basic economic capital is land labor. But going further, we know that in most countries, especially developing countries, land play a very important role. In fact, land would distinguish, would separate abject poverty from just nominal poverty, because land is used as collateral. And this is very, very specific in South Africa. If you want to start a business in South Africa or you need a bank loan, land is part of it. So the reason we are using land is a big part of generally economic development, social and economic development. But in South Africa, it plays a great role because of the way South African history has been, because of the trajectories of land policies in South Africa, the history of disposition of land and other means of livelihood. So let's look generally now. Having said that, how am I going to approach this? What am I talking about today? Of course, I'm talking about land, and the reason I'm talking about land is because of the significance of land in South Africa. But it's not only peculiar in South Africa, but other parts of the world. So how land could separate from abject poverty to the next level in our living standard and welfare. Now, when we talk about land in South Africa, there are so many things that we need to know. So to lay it properly, we'll start look at the background context of land reform in South Africa. Because this whole discourse about South African government seizing land that started in 2018 was because there was a reform, land exploration process going on. But how did we get there? How did we get to this point whereby Fox News will be talking about land reform in South Africa, and the president was to make a statement about it, and also other people started talking about how policies should be introduced to restrict such a reform? Is it really necessary? What is it that we're talking about? What is it about land reform in South Africa? Let's first look at South Africa and the land. Land is a big part of South Africa, whether you're talking about agriculture, whether you're talking about construction, mining, and all that. And interestingly, South Africa is quite big in terms of land mass. Let me give you an example. South Africa is has about 1.2 million land miles. And the population of South Africa is 58.5 million, now around 59 million. Now, 59 million people at straws in a land that is 1.5 miles or kilometer. 1.5 million, sorry, 1.2 million. Now, compare that to a place like Nigeria, where I'm from, where Nigeria is about 150 million estimate, and land mass in Nigeria is about 900. So 300 more. So you get the idea of how big South Africa is in terms of land. And this raised the question, if South Africa has such large mass of land, why is it so problematic? Why is land very big, such a big debate and a big issue? Because you can as well say that people can be, people could have access to any land they want in terms of when you compare the population over the land mass. But that's not the case. Why is that? Because South Africa has had a history of land disposition since the coming of the settlement, not the coming, the settlement of European from the 16th century. I don't want to get into the entire history, but just to mention two major legal land acts. the one of 1913, this Land Act did say that to pass 77% of arable land to Africans and leave the rest to white population. Remember, at this time, whites is about 13% of the population or less, depending on where you get to. But let me use the maximum, 13% of the population. So you assign about less than 7% of the land mass to the 7% of the population. It did not end there, because if the land that were assigned to the Black community were found to be more arable, they were taken by force. Then in 1950, with the establishment of apartheid government, which started in 1948, there were more restrictions that included the Group Area Acts. And this actually explicitly, mandates or more of legalized disposition of land. From that little amount, 7% that we're giving to Africans. So this is where it says. So by the end of apartheid in 1990s, more than 90% of the land were in the hand of white population. That is by then less than 13%. That is where we are coming from. I don't want to get into detail, because I assume that at least some people might have, most people here who are familiar with land issues in South Africa. So as a result, one of the major reform policy under apartheid, at the end of apartheid by Mandela, is that there will be a restitution of land. And of course, it caused a lot of controversy. So because of the controversy, what happened is that Mandela instituted in the constitution that the process will not allow any, will not permit, the law will not permit arbitrary privation of property, which include land. And this makes this system to rely more on what we call the willing buyer, willing seller approach, which effectively say, okay, for Black people to be able to get their land, whether the one they were repossessed from the 7% or the ancestral land that were forced, they were taken away, that were dispossessed from them. We're not talking about the general farmland now, because there's more nuance into the disposition of land under the apartheid or pre-apartheid. Because people tend to think that everything in South Africa started going sideways from 1948. No, it started way before then. So to get this done, Mandela's government tried to make it incremental. So there was a lot of compromise going on. I could explain this further if question arises. So the agreement was that there will not be arbitrarily takeover. Rather, a white person will be, a white landowner have to be willing to sell before it can be bought, and they will be compensated. This become problematic. Why did it become problematic? Because it was dependent on who is willing to sell. And most of the time, sorry, this is going back again. And most of the time, willing seller means that they can decide to sell what is not arable, or what is not habitable or arable, what the land they don't want. And also they can decide and make an arbitrary price on it. But we also know that, of course, Black South Africans, we are not left with any capital, financial or otherwise, at the end of apartheid. So the government has to pay it off. So yes, it became highly problematic. As you could see, people, and of course, at the end of the day, very little was done in terms of the land distribution. One of the major things that happened is that the ANC had the goal of ANC was to redistribute 30% of South African land in the first 5 years. But we know that that did not happen after 25 years, or even like we're about more than 25 years later. In fact, it is said that about 8% of land that promised within this 30% was only thing that has been redistributed within the willing seller and willing buyer structure. So obviously the system has not been working. But it's not just that the system has not been working. South African economy has been very problematic. This is part of the larger project I'm doing, whereby the economy has not been diversifying or expanding. The economic structure in South Africa is highly monopolistic, where, like I mentioned earlier, very few. So a lot of people in South Africa live in the shack. So if they don't get work, there's no other means of livelihood. And with the COVID, poverty has gone up. Let me just show you that. Poverty has gone up. Unemployment has gone up. So there's more demand for land in South Africa so that people can be able to actually do something for themselves. So this has led to a lot of political discourse, but not just political discourse. It has also given weapons to people from every side, whether the so-called left or right or at the middle, to use land as a political rhetoric. But let's look at South Africa in picture first and look at where land is. Like I said, if you look at demography of South Africa at the moment, this is as of 2015 or 2018, you find out that when you divide the country by race, this is what you get. Of course, South African Black made up majority of the population, 80% or and over. We have the mix, the Indian. This is the broader division of race in South Africa. It's longer than this. This is the way, broadly speaking, race was divided under apartheid. Although this has been eliminated, but the structure is still used in post-apartheid. So as of 2015-18, this is what you have. Population as of today, according to Start South Africa, is like the population has gone up by 59%, by about 59 million. But having said that, bear this in mind, this demography in mind. Having said that, what you get also is that the role of land in Africa and South African economy. If you look at this, you say, wow, if you look at land, it has a lot, it is very contribute, because if you look at just agriculture, which is 5% of the economy, then you say, okay, land does not have much impact. But what you also have to understand is construction is done on land, right? Insurance, use collateral, use land to be insured. So all parts of economic is also has, land has a big impact. Like I said, if you want to start business and you don't have collateral, you're done. Mining, as you can see, although is now getting smaller, is done on land. And earlier on, if it has a dominant impact in the economy. So the economy you have today has, mining has contributed a lot. But and when you say mining has contributed a lot, if your land, if the 7% that was allocated to African has some deposit of mineral, they will completely be forced. So this is South African economy in a whole economic structure and what contributes to what. Of course, manufacturing is still big, but the employment rate has also gone up because manufacturing is shrinking. But now look at the land issue. Having seen the economy, look at the land issue. This is a land issue. According to the audits, South African audit report, as of 2015, and now nothing has changed. 72% of the land belong to whites, while only 4% belong to Africans. Only 4%. That is problematic. That when I'm talking of arable land. Now, when you break it down, this is what you get. You know, because it's easy to just put it that way. And if this is divided by different region, you see how land works. I can, drop this later on. Now, by race, the same thing is applied, whether you're talking about urban land and farmland. Generally, farmland and agricultural holding, which means arable land and commercial land, this is where, on the left side here is where majority of land lies. This is where you talk about who owns what. Then when you divide it in terms of urban, you see the breakdown. And what you find out there is that when you look at urban land, the question you ask yourself is, what is the percentage of urban? Urban land is a very small percentage of the big, larger land. But even within this small percentage of land, you find out that within urban, where most people dwell, this is how each group own land. Then when you look at South Africa, as I've mentioned earlier, since 6 years ago, South Africa wealth inequality has been growing because the concentration of wealth is among the 20%. Like I said, this is actually better than end of apartheid. In fact, better than when I was there, when I did my core research in 2008. But one thing we find out is that the concentration of wealth has continued, which also make South African economy highly monopolistic. So the majority of people are living under poverty. The youth are out of job. Hence the picture you saw the first time where they're always on the street protesting. Because when we read reports about ongoing protests in South Africa, we don't know what is going on. This is what part of what is going on. They're jobless, they don't have a job to place to employ, or they're out of school. So many things are involved. And one of the ways of getting them into work, or at least from their perspective, is that some of these things need to be, the politicians are not doing what they say they would do. ANC have failed them, but there's no alternative. So the only alternative sometimes is to go on protest on different issues. So understanding that is very important. This is where South Africa is. This is actually most recent in terms of 2018. Then when you look at data in 2021, it has not changed. Rather, things has gotten worse. With COVID, unemployment has gotten worse, poverty has gotten worse. It's not only that, when you compare South Africa to other countries, this is what you get. South Africa has become the most unequal society in the world. It used to be Brazil, but now it's back to South Africa. And by race, this is what you get. Poverty is highest among Black, obviously, because of the history, which has not been well corrected. Like this is 2015, but the funniest part is you look at the data from Stats this year alone, it has not gotten better. It has gotten worse. In fact, everything in South Africa has gotten worse in the past 6 years. Now let's break down what they mean, because South Africa have their own way of analyzing, what they call their four dimension of poverty: health, education, living standard, economic activity. Within this, let's focus on housing. Sorry. Now, this is what you get. Remember, we are focusing on land. Why are we talking about land? Most land in South Africa are not used. More than 27 million of South Africans do not live in adequate dwelling. What happened is that some people find empty land and build what you call shack in South Africa, and they are forced to move because those empty land are owned by somebody that do not use them, people that do not use them. And by law, they can force you to move. So it's not only the private owners that are forcing to live by law, so government is also helping them. This picture is a typical example of how divided the country is. One very rich, well developed, the other one very poor. So part of the problem is housing. When more than half of the population does not have basic adequate dwelling, even when you go by the analysis of poverty, you understand why there is a problem, a problem in the country, whether you're talking about the youth unemployment or the role of land in explaining, understanding, and finding solution to the high poverty rate in the country. So now, because of all these problems, sorry, this is messing up with me. Okay, it's really, really messing up with me. Because of all this problem of high poverty, high youth unemployment, there has been a lot of demand. But of course, Zuma left, and because of his he's seen as a populist. When Ramaphosa came in, he tried to also compensate. That's why it is called, because it's politics. What happened is this: he also was drawn into this politics. The bottom line is this: land reform in South Africa of willing seller, willing buyer has not worked. It has not worked in any way. And as a result, they started the process of land reform. He was persuaded and he made a lot of promises during his campaign. This led to the process of land reform in South Africa. And of course, for those that do not know, like Carson and, sorry to say, President Trump, they weighed in. But in real sense, anybody and most people, even in South Africa, even white farmers and white landowners know that there is need for land reform. Because if they don't do land reform, it will lead to more, to worse social malaise that will affect the landowners at the moment. Because at a point, there will be a point where the people that are dispossessed, hungry youth will, lash out. So there seems to be more consensus on land reform, or the way land is destroyed, the implementation of the initial land reform. The major problem is how would it go? So the one that came to be is this: that in 2008, a process of re-examining the initial willing buyer, willing seller process came to be, led by Malawi, the leader of economic freedom fighters. So the proposal is exploration without compensation, hence what led to today's new land reform process in South Africa. But the question we should be asking is this: what is it? Because this is where someone like Toxin, is it Tucker Carlson, started his rhetoric of South African government dispossessing land from the white farmers and killing them. You remember, I see the headshot. I mean, what is on the news? He's not the only one. There is a researcher with American think tanker that also, in fact, argues that, I'll come back to that this should be stopped. American government should intervene and stop this by imposing some policy or trade policy and blocking South Africa like they did in Zimbabwe. I'll come back to that. But what exactly is this land appropriation? Like we know, as appropriation alone is how governments take possession of some property, which is done here in the US, apparently. But for this particular case, is that governments will take over some of this property and distribute them to what they call the beneficial, the people that were formerly dispossessed. However, the difference from willing buyer, willing seller is that some of this property taken over by government would not be compensated. Governments also, within the same reform process, promised that title deed will be given to some of these people, Black South Africans that have been dispossessed under apartheid. What is it saying? It's saying that sometimes when they're given land, they're given a lease of, say, 50 years. They're not given a title deed. So there's lack of security. People are under the impression that this is not your land, so you probably will not do much with your land. And the argument with some of the Black farmers that have gained this type of lease is that for business to develop, especially farming business, it takes long. By the time you're about to establish or stabilize yourself, the 50 years is over. And when we talk about future developments and wealth creation, in terms of generational wealth creation, this will not be able to hold because they are not giving ownership. And again, the argument is that they cannot use the land as a collateral in the bank. Another area is this: land has been occupied by sharecroppers that worked in the white farms. Are not theirs, so they were forced. It's part of forced eviction. For instance, during the time of exploration, the debate on exploration, a lot of people were forced to move out of the place. So the debate is this: we don't have anything. Because let's hear the human story regarding this. We don't have anything. We've lived here. When we work in the farm, that our land were dispossessed from us, and we're forced to work in the farm over generation. And we cannot say this is what we have gotten from working in the farm. Even where we live, we can be asked to live. We can be forced to live at any time. So I'm trying to explain what it means by title deed. So this is part of government's promise. I always say promise because with politicians, it's promise, even when there's a legal backing. So that's in kind of explaining what is into the exploration without compensation. But the real case and bone of contention is this. And the question is this: is Tucker Carlson actually correct? Absolutely not. In every way you can look at it. Number one is this: when they say they will do exploration without compensation, they mean land that are not in use. Like I said earlier on, I showed you the picture of shacks dwelling, informal dwellings. There are loads of empty lands in South Africa. 1.2 million kilometers of land, miles of land. That's what South Africa has. 59 maximum of the population. Obviously, there are loads of empty lands. But it happens that these empty lands that have not been used in decades, if not a century, are owned by some people that are not even ready to use them. And if these dwellers don't have a place to live, then they go into these places that has been empty and try to couple up something to live with, And that is where you have a lot of shack dwellers in South Africa, especially in Cape Town, in Johannesburg. When I was in South Africa, you pass by, you see a lot of this, shack dwellers. No wonder you have more than half of the population living in informal dwellings. But even these informal dwellings, they are not safe. Why are they not safe? Because they can be forced to move out of these places. So government is saying, if your land is not in use and the owner are not even ready to use them, or the purpose is for them to benefit from market appreciation, because that's what willing seller, willing buyer have come to be, then they will come explore the land and not pay. So this is just explaining. I'm not saying yet whether this is a good or bad, but just giving you the idea of what is the content of exploration without compensation means. So by 2020, this has actually become part of the law. But it's not all good news. There was a lot of debates. So some, led by someone like Ruth Hall, who has been a dominant and a very prominent land scholar, legal scholar in South Africa. Her argument is this: she said, yes, there's need for land reform. the government has not done what they're supposed to do. 30% is too small. 30% the promise is too small, but within this 30%, only less than 10% has been distributed. Most people that have legal deed of their land that they were double dispossessed have not been given land. And most of the time, the land that is being compensated is most of the time is not useful for farming or doing most of the things. So there is an agreement over this. But she argue, I'm using her argument because there's a lot of people on this side of the debate, that there is no need to change the law, because changing the law or reviewing the law will not make land distribution better. But governments have already have enough power to distribute land with current, I mean, now before 2018 legal land reform structure. But the problem is that government ANC has not been willing to do this distribution. Other people have argued that, well, there's need for that, especially when it comes to unused land. Those are the bigger, in terms of the big divide in the debate. But people have also argued that, now let's do this, let's think of this. There's lack of trust there's lack of trust that ANC government or any other government that will come in the future will actually do this. Because over almost 30 years, they've not seen any results. So this is not just about white population, but also by the Black population, which is why someone like Malawi of Freedom Fighters Party has been very prominent in every political debate in South Africa and had been influential, not because he's doing better, but someone that gives voice to some of these issues. And there has been ambiguity in the clauses that has been within this clause of willing buyer, willing seller. In every legal structure or every legal saying, there's always ambiguity. And some people have said this is all political. President Ramaphosa is just using it to maintain his political position. It's just a way of compromising that nothing will come out of it. Then the other people that do not support this because of unwilling seller and appropriation without compensation say it undermines property rights. And this is one of the arguments, global, I will call it global discourse. Economics, some of economics or non-economics are using. But is this all a valid argument? To a large extent, they are valid arguments, are also challenges that current governments need to overcome in establishing a foundation of how future governments will implement land reform, because it's very important that this foundational base, the foundational base is solid. But whether this will happen, we are yet to see that. So these are challenges, but the question is this: these challenges is also, especially the case of either lack of trust, ambiguity, or political, but more importantly, the case of undermined property rights. Because the argument of property rights is what is used forcefully, I would say, in a very disingenuous way by people that are using this the reform debate to undermine whether it's going to happen or not. For instance, this has also led to the debate in comparison of South Africa, comparing South Africa to Zimbabwe. Can South Africa be like Zimbabwe? Marian Shupi, a researcher in one of the conservative think institutes, was on has talk during this debate, and his argument is this: this new land reform in South Africa is literally stealing land from properties from white South Africans. So, like they normally say, a reverse apartheid. And he called President Trump to warn South African government that if they do this, they should be suspended from the African Growth and Opportunity Act as Zimbabwe. Because this is from the arguments, he gave a litany of of Zimbabwean land process. But one thing we don't understand, one thing we have to understand is this. When we talk about Zimbabwe and South Africa, land issue in Zimbabwe is not the way we tend to hear it in the media. It started with Lancaster Accord, which Britain and its supporters promised billions, and which they did not fulfill their part. And they played this game with Mugabe for a very long time until Mugabe decided to do what he called nationalization. So it's beyond what they think. And when Britain lobbied the rest to suspend Zimbabwe, so it was because they wanted to use it. It was after the suspension that Zimbabwe threatened and used the land reform. I'm not holding any brief for Mugabe because he managed the entire thing wrongly. But it's not the same. South Africa will not become Zimbabwe. And in fact, if it ever happened, it is the current landowners that will suffer most. Someone that is done can, who has more to lose is the current white owners. Which is why a lot of people, when they use this, is aware of highly misguided, is a wrong narrative, but it more of puts fear in the entire discourse of land reform in South Africa and does not benefit anybody. I can explain more in terms of this comparison between South Africa and Zimbabwe, but what I can say now is this: no, it's not the same at all. But the narrative of Zimbabwe is a way of putting fear in the whole discourse of land reform in South Africa. But that's not all. The major issue we should face is this: is there a way of going beyond? Can this land reform actually work? The current land reform, can it work? It could. But I would say a lot is dependent on how the government manages it. To some extent, I agree with Ms. Paul that government has not done enough. Although I disagree that, that now I'm saying my personal opinion from my own study and observation in what is going on in South Africa, there's a lot of land that is unused. If the focus remain on actually redistributing this land that is not being used, that does not produce any economic benefit to anybody, so the people that could use it, then there will be, South Africa will go a long way. And I have to say, compensation without, exploration without compensation is not new. South Korea did it. China did it wrongly in terms of it involved a lot of violence. South Korea did it and it pays off. A lot of some countries did it and it pays off. So it depends on who is doing it right. So it's very important when doing it. I draw some of these points from Mandami, so I am not going to claim all of them. That, but I do agree with his analysis that there's a lot of detail that will happen on the national, on local and community level. The way this land is handled by the chiefs, who get what matters a lot. Because at the end of the day, it should not be turned into another elite capture, which is what is going on in South Africa generally today. And this land distribution or land reform process should also incentivize young farmers, urban dwellers, to produce their own food, because food is mainly most of the argument that people use, that food security in South Africa will go the way of Zimbabwe. It's not gonna go, but there's also a way of expanding, not just food security, but improving living standard. Black on their own do not have capital in any form of capital. So there is need for government to encourage Black farmers, but also completely de-racialize agricultural sector and encourage young people. So going further, in as much as there's challenges ahead, I don't want to dwell on what they're not going to get right, because that's what we tend to do as scholars. We tend to dwell on what is wrong or what is not going to get right. But I want to also say there is a way it can work. So in conclusion, I think my 45 minutes is gone. Land is a very critical part of the economy and wealth creation. And I completely, from the point of view that South Africa does not necessarily need, just talk about, South Africa should not focus on wealth transfer, but on wealth creation. And land distribution should be part of wealth creation. And until it involves a more robust approach of incentivizing or helping people that cannot do it, that does not have any capital foundation to farm or use the land in terms of more productive way, then nothing will be done. It will be handing from empty land to another empty land that does not produce anything. So land is important, but it is important if it can produce wealth. South Africa has abundant land, as I have said. Willing buyer and willing seller is highly problematic. It's not going to work in South Africa. I've been to South Africa, I've studied it for a very long time. And I've talked to a lot of people, even a lot of white landowners are saying it's not going to work. That's another thing. That's the part that we don't tend to hear. A lot of whites are ready to have this land distributed because it pays everybody. And as I said, South Africa will not end like Zimbabwe. The political, economic, and social structure is different. And it could help in terms of diversifying economic South African economy and breaking the monopoly that exists in the economic structure of South Africa, if well handled. A lot depend on political will anyway. And on that note, I will end and wait for your questions and questions to explore or explain more issues in detail. I think okay, this has stopped. Okay, thank you guys. I've already exceeded my 45 minutes, but I hope not for too long.
Oh, you're fine. Thank you so much, Dr. Agupusi.
So now I'm going to be looking forward to your questions and your questions or comments. It will be helpful as I move further. Like I said earlier on, this is part of a larger project. So your question will help me to think deeper and also probably elaborate more on some things that I was not able to explain well.
Very good. Yeah, and I think Denson has his hand. Do you want to talk, Denson?
Thank you. I think when I talk, it takes a very short time, and I promise I'll take just 1 minute or less. Thank you so much for that very engaging discussion. I did my PhD at the University of Stellenbosch, and so I'm quite familiar with some of the things you're mentioning. So my first question is, when President Mandela died, was it 2012 or thereabout? You know, there were already questions about, is he a hero or is he a sellout? Is he a hero also? I mean, the questions were muffled. You dared not bring them out, but there were a few discomforts. I remember Malema saying that it's no wonder that the white people mourned Mandela more than the black people, because he claimed that he had signed a very good deal with them. So my question is, you know, what's the public discourse on Nelson Mandela's role in this present day debacle that you have explained so well? What are the people's views about what he could have done, how he could have used his international goodwill image to make to come up with a better settlement? And then finally, the Malema factor in this whole debate. In your own assessment, is Malema and his party part of the solution or part of the problem? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should I go ahead or collect the other question?
You can go ahead.
Okay, let me start with Malema, since it's the last one. Then I'll go ahead and talk more in detail, because I think Malema question is easier for me to answer. I've been following Malema since he came, and in fact, although I'm not going to have a chapter on Malema, but I'm going to have a chapter on some of the union he's directing and what's the pattern that have existed. I think it would be actually wrong for me to say he's completely the problem, because he's raising some of these issues. If I say he's the problem, then I'll be lying to myself, The reason that they have this new talk or discourse or deliberation that led to reform is because he has been very influential and has been, making a lot of impact. So I would say he is both. He is both problem and solution, but it depends on how the ruling party manages these problems. Because if, like what they did, they were able to draw some of the points he's raising in terms of facing the reality and addressing the problem of land, that is a solution, right? But if you look at Malame, in so many things he's doing, he's more of, you see him as is more of a problem in terms of the whole discourse of South Africa and the whole process of transformation. He kind of flamed the fire. I would say he's a good answer to Tucker Carlson, although Tucker Carlson is not necessarily a politician. But he flamed the fire a lot and now made most of the discourse about race instead of dealing with the real issues. So that's the way I can answer in terms of Malema, but I'm open to pushback from you. Now, Mandela's case has been quite interesting to me. When I was doing my field work in 2007, 2008, and even till now, Mandela has always been this untouchable in South Africa. So in terms of public discourse, it's not just white, but also Black. Mandela is untouchable. And when someone dies, that is elevated more. But initially, I was very critical of the approach that Mandela took. There's a book by Johnson, I could get it. He did a detailed analysis of the role of Mandela in what we have today as South Africa. And he was very critical of Mandela, saying that he compromised a lot. And if you look at some of members of COSOTU, they also argue that he compromised a lot. But there's one thing I will say for him. He made it very clear that his role is to unite the country. So when he said his role is to unite the country, there was a lot of need for compromise. There was also a lot of, you have to look at the external factor that plays role. There was a lot of threats on how to hold the country together. There was a lot of push from the global north, especially the US, UK, drawn from World Bank and co. Then this is a guy that lived in prison. So his main goal was to unite the country. Mbeki was someone that's more aware and familiar with the economic aspect of it. I would say Mbeki was more of a sellout than Mandela, but I will not call any of them outrightly sellout, but in terms of comparison, because Mbeki was in charge of economic structure of the country, and he has more compromise because he believes that the best way of moving forward is to elevate some Black, a few number of Black in the same position. So when Black economic empowerment initially was introduced, it just like picking some few Black and empowering them with a lot of capital. So the distribution has to only happen on the top. So it became a big problem. And that's what they call the cappuccino effect. It was Mbeki that took over those economic process. And that's why 25 years later, South African economy remained highly monopolistic. So this is how I'm going to explain it, unless you want further explanation. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you very much, you did.
Okay, I think Shingi, you can talk.
Hello, Doctor. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I was struck by the way you drew the parallel with Zimbabwe, and I wondered, and I've also done a little bit of work on this, particularly on the Zimbabwean side, and you did say that the political and economic structures are different between the two, which they are. But I was wondering if maybe we are too, if we can be too confident that it won't go down the same way. And I say this because of this one reason, that the political economic structures may be different, but the fundamentals of how we got here, which is there's an agreement to redistribute the land, Lancaster House, then they put a willing buyer, willing seller sort of platform, and that goes on for like 2 decades, with nothing much being done. And at some point, it's pockets of the masses, right? Not just Mugabe who came. In fact, when that first came up, the government was very, was not, you know, they were pretty acrimonious to the people who were invading the land. And I'm just wondering if, and also we've seen in South Africa, right, that South Africa is not immune to uprisings from the public as far as this goes. So I'm wondering if you see, you know, when we say that it can never be like that, but can we not see the potential of a public uprising that initiates this sort of thing at some point?
Oh no, I don't want to use the word never, because the word never it shouldn't be existing in any way, in any point, especially in this type of situation. So what I mean in terms of it will not go in that way is this. Whether there will be uprising, I think there's more chances of uprising more in South Africa than you actually got in the case of Zimbabwe. Now, if you look at this picture here, land or death, that says a lot. And if you notice one thing, South Africans are very good in protesting one issue or the other. So, but that's not the way of Zimbabwe. When I mean the way of Zimbabwe is this: when somebody like the guy I showed you earlier on, Miriam Troop, says something like, "Oh, South Africa, Zimbabwe went without food, the economy completely collapsed and crumbled." That's what I mean. Because when they say going the way of Zimbabwe, that's what they mean. Whereby there will be no food on the shelf. My first study on land and development was on Zimbabwe. Yeah, you're right, the fundamentals are the same. Literally, people lands were killed and buried in the land, and we are taking over. The people that survive are forced to work in the land. That's what happened in Zimbabwe. But nobody talks about this. Now, when you look at that's why I said, for us to understand Zimbabwe, we look at nuances that happens. One thing we have to understand in Zimbabwe, remember the post where he says that South Africa should be suspended the way Zimbabwe was suspended. Britain was able to rally the entire West to go against Zimbabwe as one. Then this is also, compare the external factor to internal dynamism of political dynamism of Mugabe, possessed with power and control, the way he managed it. So in as much as the fundamentals are the same, the other imperative that exists is not the same. But whether there will be more protests whereby the masses tend to take over land by force is more likely in case of South Africa. But why South Africans, a lot of them understand this dynamism, despite the fact they are using the case, the crumble, the fall of Zimbabwe as an example in international debate. They also understand when anything happens, it's going to affect them. So a lot of white South African landowners and farmers are for redistribution. So there is a lot of things going on within, there's layers going on within these two countries, which is why I say it's not going to be the same. It's not going to go in the same way. And South Africa is a more established economy than Zimbabwe, a more diversified economy. You have more interest. Let me give you an example. There was a genocide in Rwanda. Nobody cares. They didn't have any interest, right? Nobody cares. Then that was why the genocide happened. Then there was issue with Iraq, Iran. Now they're interested in Iraq and Afghanistan because there was something to get. Let me give you another example. Because these are economic interests. It matters a lot. There is more economic interest in South Africa that it will not lead to pulling the entire country down, because it will affect the power that be on the global economic and power structure. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, US intervened. It's not the only place that we invaded. Its interest on Kuwait is oil. So there's some things South Africa has that the global North need. Now, in as much as they might try to have some political way of influencing what is happening, they will not allow that to happen. That's where I'm coming from. So there's so many areas to look at: external influence and internal.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so we don't have any question, but I just have a comment. Maybe when I'm not very familiar with.
I think Eric Panda has a question.
Okay, Eric. Okay, let's have Eric. Go ahead, Eric.
Hi, my name is Eric Ponder, and you mentioned earlier the milieu or the negotiations between Mandela and whatnot. And I think we can't look. We have to look at that within pressure points, as you mentioned. But how do we look at the negotiation in the first 10 years of the Mandela administration, and how do we separate those two and think about what was the progress or what were the benefits of the first 10 years of the Mandela administration and moving certain policies forward, such as lowering unemployment and what have you? Do you think about separating those two?
Yeah, I think we can separate those two, to be frank. That's why I said, yeah, I was initially critical of Mandela. But when you look further, you find out he made it clear. One thing is this: Mandela was able to hold the country together. We needed a trust. We needed a symbol of trust in South Africa. And that symbol of trust that blew the country together is Mandela. And that is very important. If the country is not together, where are we going from there? I'm not from South Africa. I'm using we because I work a lot there. So that's one. And then he, in as much as the idea, using land as an example, is not just land, other economic policies that came in. There has been there's always a lot of threat by the capital, what I will call the capital, or the people that control the capital economy in South Africa. Number one, they first say they're gonna move everything outside South Africa, and they did. So they have the power. The stock exchange was moved to London. So it's not necessarily Mandela. The only thing Mandela would have done is to put law, but putting this law also means that you're driving more people back. But there's a lot of dependency by the ANC-led government that without the white control of power, economy, the country cannot move forward. Now, if you notice, the first agreed policy of South Africa was completely removed, and GEAR was introduced. That is where the problem came in. And this GEAR, growth, employment, and redistribution is just a name. There was no employment and redistribution in the entire process. It's just like South Africa, when the entire world have come to reject structural adjustment program, the economic power that be completely brought in the entire policy of structural adjustment program and implemented it under Mbeki. So there is a separation. It's not like there's nothing. Remember that Mandela was there for about 5 years. The rest was under Mbeki. So there's a way you could separate it in terms of the settlement, the agreed and compromised way of moving the country economically forward. In fact, if you have followed the agreed agreement, I don't think they would have been here. But when structural adjustment program under GEAR was introduced, it changed the entire discourse and of course the entire outcome. So that's where I could separate it. Yes, pressure point was there, but what they agreed on wasn't that bad. if you look at it. In fact, Patrick Bond has a book, Work Left, Talk Left and Work Right, by describing how Mbeki approached it. I hope I answered your question. Eric, I don't know if I hope I'm able to at least address some of your questions. Hello? I think there's a...
Okay. He said yes.
Okay, sorry. All right, I saw his.
So I was saying I'm not very familiar with the land reform in South Africa, and your explanation was very helpful for me to understand. But what I kept thinking was the debate of reparation in the US. And I was just wondering if, maybe not, you haven't thought about that. And my question is, you said Mandela's role was mainly to unite the country. But if there is so much problem into the reforming the land, doesn't that tell us that there is a problem with the history? Has the history of wrong been recognized? Wouldn't it be much easier for the land reform to move forward and be more successful? So how much has the history of wrong that has been going on for a while, what effect does it have in the success, or maybe the lack of success, or the problems that land reform is facing in South Africa?
I think that's a very important observation. Some have argued that South African Black allow white South Africa, apartheid South Africa, to get away with what they did so easily, which is why the reform has not gone properly. But also, we argue that, maybe I'm more of a peaceful person. So this is a place you have a dilemma. Do they let them go easily or not? There's the revenge side of human nature that will say, no, you have to deal with them completely. But there's also this other side will say, let's peace reign. So yes, they all understand the history. There's nobody in South Africa that is not some idea familiar with it. The understanding of thinking you understand and being familiar with the history is different from experiencing history. And most of the people now did experience the history. So that will not be a problem, but is the agreement of how we can move forward, how South African can move forward has been the case. I'm not blaming everything completely on whether people understand the history, which is why you still see a lot of protests. But I'm blaming a lot on ANC, that when they got power, they forget history themselves. And if you notice, one of the few people that I can count with one hand, because my thesis was on, or dissertation was on Black economic empowerment, and it explored all this whole narrative from different angles, looking at political economy of the entire transformation program and transition from political transition and economic transition. The fundamental thing that people need to understand is this. In 1994, there was official political transition in South Africa, which is still a process. But there was no economic transition. And there's still not enough economic transition in South Africa. So there was a transfer of power politically. But if we agree with someone like Asamoah Robinson that political power is what determines, then we have to hold the agency of ANC highly responsible. Like Ruth Hall will argue, they have the power to change things. Ramaphosa is one of the few people that benefited from economic empowerment, but he's also one of the anti-apartheid individuals. So he lived it. Why are they not doing enough? Zuma was one of the populists. He didn't do much. It was in his era that you have state capture in a very elaborate way. So yes, history matters. But the people with power are not actually, because they've moved, they're forgetting that the history, it is that history that, destroyed the life of generations of people in South Africa. But it's also the same history that gave them the opportunity they have now. So there's that elite capture that is still going on in South Africa. So I would strongly argue that a lot of responsibility should, ANC should bear a lot of this responsibility.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so we'll thank our guest. Thank you so much, Dr. Agupusi, for sharing your research with us. It's very much appreciated. And thank you everybody for attending. We'll see you next Thursday. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you guys, and thank everyone for attending, and thank you.